Romney Marsh is an integral part of the district of Shepway in the county of Kent, with its administrative centre at Folkestone. Shepway is a corruption of shipway, or refers to the English Channel, the busiest shipping channel in the world. As an artist, I have painted and drawn on Romney Marsh for a number of years, and am mindful of the words of England's foremost landscape painter, John Constable, who wrote, "We see nothing until we understand it." So let us first of all look at an old map of Romney Marsh and the related marshes, dated 1737 AD. It was made, and I quote, "for the right honourable, the lords and other proprietors of the lands and these levels, a description of Romney Marsh, Wallen Marsh, Dengie Marsh and Guildford Marsh." This map has been photocopied and hand-coloured, the better to read it. It takes us back 260 years and provides a window onto these marshes when they were very vulnerable to the rages of the sea. On this map we see the Ree Wall. It is coloured red, and this wall in the last century stood 15 foot high, was 8 miles long, and was man-made and constructed from Appledore, which is sited on rising ground, to New Romney, which is sited on the coast. In 1737, the Ree Wall, as we see, joined a wide, substantial shingle beach laid down by tidal action, which ran from New Romney to Hythe. In 1737, this shingle bank was raised by man-made earth walls called the Knock and Dymchurch walls. Today these walls are made with reinforced concrete, but in 1737 they had to be constantly repaired. The shingle banks and man-made walls have kept the sea at bay for many centuries. Thus, the shingle beach and walls linked to the Ree Wall, coupled to the high ground to the north, enclose Romney Marsh, creating 20,000 acres of some of the most fertile land in the United Kingdom. Were there no sea defences today, Romney Marsh would be 5 foot underwater at high tide. And if we look carefully at the Romney Marsh in 1737, which is east of the Ree Wall, we see a complex drainage system in place. But there are no saltwater gullies intruding onto Romney Marsh from the sea. But drainage takes place out of the marsh into the sea. A different situation existed on Guildford and Wallen marshes, west of the Ree Wall. We see clearly saltwater gullies intruded into them, and as the tides rose, in came salt water. When high tides were linked to storms, both these marshes were flooded. However, the Ree Wall prevented that flooding to flow into Romney Marsh. Dengie Marsh, however, was in 1737 and continues today to have a unique characteristic. It is constantly being enlarged by tidal deposits at Dungeness by 2 metres a year. As to the date of the construction of the Ree Wall, that remains an enigma. It has been postulated it was made by the Romans, others have put forward that it was a Saxon construction, others still that the wall was built in early medieval times in the 12th or 13th centuries. What would be true to say is the Romans had enormous expertise in constructing and maintaining sea defences, and later I will return briefly to consider the Romans on Romney Marsh and to discuss the different possibilities as far as the date and give reasons for my own opinions. As an artist, I follow in the steps of John Piper, who 50 years ago, in 1947, wrote and illustrated a book titled Romney Marsh. Small in format, commissioned by King Penguin's editor Nicholas Pevesner and published in 1950. Many artists and writers have drawn, painted and written about Romney Marsh. No other painter that I'm aware of, however, has undertaken such a comprehensive written and visual survey of the marsh, employing paintings and drawings, albeit some slight, recording all the Romney Marsh churches with brief descriptions of each one, and these descriptions are always interesting and pertinent. My own visual survey makes response to all the medieval marsh churches, the marsh landscape, and some of its animals. I have made no attempt to give comprehensive dates of the churches and when they were built or the additions made to them, since these details are available in all the marsh churches. I also acknowledge the book written by Richard Ingram's, which was illustrated by Fay Godwin, with evocative black and white photographs titled Romney Marsh and the Royal Military Canal. From Lymm, close to the Shepway Stone Cross, I painted this watercolour on a winter's day in 1997. There are cloud traces in the sky. The sun is reflected on the calm waters of the English Channel. Where the sea and land meet, they are not distinguished by elevation of the land, but by the darker colours and tones of the land. The gate leads down a steep slope to the Royal Military Canal. Above the gate is a screen of leafless trees, and behind which are shingle excavations filled with groundwater, sparkling in the sunshine. A few yards left of the wooden gate is an ancient site, and at this site there is a Shepway stone cross, and for centuries on this spot open-air meetings were held to discuss matters of import to marsh peoples. The Church of St Stephen's at Lymm, with its Norman tower, is some 500 yards west of the wooden gate and can be approached through a small wood of magnificent beech trees. The branches of some trees growing adjacent to the churchyard stone wall drop over it, and from this point outside the churchyard in spring the leaf canopy partially obscures the church. The church is close to the manor house, once the residence of Archdeacons of Canterbury, was built in 1420 AD. Both church and former manor house were almost certainly built from stones used to build Portus Romanus at the foot of the escarpment. And vicars of Lymm date back to AD 1291. But at that time, Lymm was called by its Roman name Limani, and the name since then has changed 6 times. And an historical note that at the end of the last war, the church was damaged by a V1 flying bomb, which fell close by. In winter, the leafless branches of the beech trees cut across but do not obscure the sky. Painting this watercolour, I could just see the English Channel and cloud shadows moving across it, and the dark green marsh levels which meet the sea. In addition to shingle excavations at West Hythe, I could also discern a second branch of the Royal Military Canal cutting across the marsh, a slash of quicksilver. On another winter's day I painted on the southern perimeter of St Stephen's churchyard, where the Lymm escarpment drops sharply down to the flat levels of Romney Marsh. Immediately in front of me was a tangle of briar and soft white clusters of old man's beard, in strong contrast with the purply browns, umbers and siennas of undergrowth and a wooded copse lower down the slope. Pine trunks and younger shoots provide vertical thrusts in the composition, in contrast to the horizontal of the marsh levels. The curve of the coast, a flattened ellipse, could be seen between the pine trunks, moving towards Dungeness in the far distance. And the patchwork quilt of fields were coloured ochres. The land was dormant, awaiting spring's greening, and on its fields countless ewes would shortly give birth to their lambs. Romney Marsh is in many ways a strange and mysterious place, which, however hard I look at it, paint it, move about in it, or study its geology and its history, it never seems to wholly reveal itself. Many writers have written about Romney Marsh, including H.G. Wells, novelist and science fiction writer. He had built Spade House in West Folkestone overlooking the English Channel in the village of Sandgate, and from Spade House Wells had distant views too of Hythe and the eastern marshlands. H.G. Wells in Kipps wrote, "Everyone who stays in Folkestone goes sooner or later to Lymm. The castle became a farmhouse, and the farmhouse itself, now ripe and venerable, wears the walls of the castle as a little man wears a big man's coat. You look down upon the sheep-dotted slopes to where beside the canal and under the trees the crumbled memories of Rome sleep forever. And away below one's feet, almost at the bottom of the hill, the marsh begins and spreads in a mighty crescent that sweeps about the sea. The marsh dotted with the church towers of forgotten and medieval towns, and breaking at last into the low blue hills by Winchelsea and Hastings. East hangs France between the sea and the sky, and round the north, bounding the wide perspectives of farms and houses and woods, the downs with their hangers and chalk pits sustain the passing shadows of the sailing clouds." This watercolour was painted on a near cloudless winter's day, and the walls of Lymm Castle are on the extreme right. Sheep graze, as Wells described, on the grass slopes below it, and to the bottom left there are the fragmented ruins of the walls of Portus Romanus. Bright sunshine bathed the land in a crystal clear light, and in the far distance a low white bank of mist stretched across the marsh levels, and it was not difficult to see it not as mist but as a sheet of salt water covering marshlands as it had done in centuries past before the marshes had been wrested from the sea. At the foot of the Lymm escarpment, below the Shetway Cross, is St Mary's Road. It is a narrow road and a dead end. A number of houses and buildings on either side include glass houses, and on the opposite side is a simple roofless stone church dedicated to St Mary. It has Norman traces. The eastern arch, which once divided the nave from the chancel, is transitional, and the chancel is demolished. The stone walls offer innumerable roosting places for wild pigeons and domestic doves, which have made this ruin their own. Doves, symbol of peace, and in Christian iconography, a symbol of the third aspect of the Godhead, the Holy Ghost. Adjacent to the church is the home of Brian and Jenny Oxley, artists and teachers both. Brian was born on the Marsh, went to school at New Romney on the Marsh, and for 2 decades he and his wife have lived on the edge of the marsh. In 1995, Brian Oxley organised 2 concurrent exhibitions titled A Celebration of Romney Marsh. 80 artists were included in it, contributing 4 works each, of which 2 were shown in the Sassoon Gallery at the Folkestone Public Library, and 2, appropriately, in the Marsh Gallery in Southland School at New Romney. Brian asked me to design the poster, and I used one of my watercolours of Romney Marsh from Lymm to illustrate it. Many of the artists who participated in the exhibition shared the deepest concern with the exhibition organisers at the proposed building of a double carriage road planned to come over the Lymm escarpment on concrete stilts and then continue over the marsh to Devon, crossing some of the loveliest countryside in England. Bonfires were lit in protest along the entire proposed route, burning like a fiery necklace. And the road, following a lengthy public inquiry, was approved, but then shelved. All but 4 of the exhibitors were living artists. Those 4 included Edward Burrough, an artist of distinction who lived at Rye. Another was the gifted amateur artist Winston Churchill, who in the years before the Second World War was a guest at the Sassoon residence at Port Lympne House, where he painted the house overlooking the marsh. These paintings, or some of them, are on loan, which can be seen in Port Lympne House, a house now restored after years of neglect by John Aspinall, and it is part of his magnificent zoo, which runs from the top of the escarpment down to the Royal Military Canal. It is strange and wonderful in a world where natural habitats are incessantly abused and all too often destroyed, and where species are being wiped out at a speed which defies our imaginations, to find an eccentric millionaire who loves his mammals, Another artist included in the exhibition, a celebration of Romney Marsh, was Paul Nash, who in the First World War was appointed a war artist. He recorded the killing fields of the Western Front, portraying its devastated landscapes in memorable works. After that war, he rented a cottage at Dymchurch, where in paintings, drawings and etchings he made images of the concrete sea wall stretching from Dymchurch towards Littlestone, and also paintings of the brooding sea. He wrote, "I have stayed on Romney Marsh and have watched the sky darken across the dyke flats at Dymchurch and the channel towards the French coast as the sun sets at my back, and have noticed the strange unity of sea, sky and earth that grows unnoticed at this time and place." The other artist represented in the celebration of Romney Marsh was John Piper, who, as a boy during his school holidays, explored Romney Marsh on his bike. He was appointed a war artist in the Second World War, and after it he returned to Romney Marsh to paint and draw it in 1947. John Piper, in his book, begins his description of Romney Marsh with these words: "In its flatness and sense of remoteness, quite unlike the rest of the beautiful county to which it belongs, Romney Marsh yet bears plenty of Kentish traces. The weather-boarded houses, the trim fences and the trimmer hedges, the poplars and the long-roofed, odd-shaped Kentish churches are there, and it has the absence of barrenness, the look of having been used and almost overused by man that belongs to the rest of the county." Many other artists and writers have responded to Romney Marsh. Richard Ingrams wrote, "If you go there, you will immediately know a feeling of boundless space, a solemn stillness, a silence that is rare today in southeast England, flat fields covered with thousands of sheep, and even in the height of summer, a slight sense of eeriness." And Brian Oxley wrote in the catalogue of the exhibition, a celebration of Romney Marsh, "The landscape, which is, in the last analysis, dominated by the quality of the light and the overwhelming sky." And in the same catalogue, Margaret Bentnell wrote, "Among the treasures of the marsh are the ancient churches. A number of these churches and scattered population of the marsh has led, through the years, to problems of upkeep. Until in 1962, they were gathered under the umbrella of the Romney Marsh group of churches. Later still, the Romney Marsh Historic Churches Trust, which was founded, and wonderful work has been done in ensuring that these remarkable but lovely churches are looked after." So whilst the above writers rightly stress the marsh with its boundless space, in its flatness and sense of remoteness, or the problems of conservation of ancient buildings, it is well to remember the dark forces of nature unleashed and the Herculean efforts by man to repair and restore the violent devastation caused by violent storms in the sea over the centuries. The great storm of 1287, and here I quote, "When the sea, driven by violent winds, overwhelmed this tract and made great havoc of men, cattle and buildings, and having destroyed the little populous village of Prom Hill, changed the channel of the Rother, which here at New Romney emptied itself into the sea, and filled its mouth, making it a new and shorter course by Rye, so that it gradually deserted this town, which from this time declined and lost much of its ancient populousness and dignity." Another storm in 1334 completed the ruin of New Romney harbour, and in another great storm of several centuries later, in 1703, 2,000 people are said to have lost their lives. Before reinforced concrete walls were built along the coast from Hythe to Littlestone, the maintenance of banks and walls against the rage of the sea was constant. Earth walls, we read on the map of 1737, were armed and fenced against the rage and wrath of the sea by bushes and faggots of thorn, fastened to the said wall with oaken stakes, called knock of piles, continually maintained at the charge of the whole level. There were other dangers. French raiding ships landed along the coast, pillaging and burning. In 1293, Hythe was attacked and burnt. In 1378, Folkestone was attacked and burnt. And likewise in 1380, Appledore was attacked and burnt. And the fine church at Winchelsea was set alight. And although it was in part repaired, it was never entirely rebuilt. Cinque Ports, of which New Romney and Hythe are but two, traditionally had supplied ships and men for the King's Navy, or the Queen's Navy in the case of Queen Elizabeth, and in return were granted a large measure of autonomy in making their own laws. With this independence, smuggling goods in and out of the country became endemic, particularly when central government added taxes to imported and exported goods. In 1538, Henry VIII, fearing a continental invasion, built castles at Sandown, Deal, Walmer and Sandgate, built with the masonry from the dissolved monasteries and abbeys. And in 1803, Napoleon's Grande Armée was encamped at Boulogne, preparing to invade Britain. The White Cliffs at Dover afforded a natural defence for Dover Castle and the Western Heights, and these White Cliffs running back to Folkestone. And in Folkestone, high clay cliffs also act as a protection against invasion. But from Sandgate to Fairlight in East Sussex, there is no coastal high ground, and faced with this geology, Prime Minister Pitt, in consultation with Major General David Dundas and Lieutenant General John Moore, agreed on two lines of defence. A wide and deep canal was dug from West Hythe to Fairlight in East Sussex between 1804 and 1806. My watercolour shows excavated earth was thrown up on the bank furthest from the sea, and this would have provided cover to defending troops. The canal throughout its length zigzags to give field guns a clear line of fire. And in this watercolour, on the crest of the escarpment, we see to the right Lymm Castle and the Norman Church, and below them lie the ruins of the Roman Portus Lamamus. The second line of defence took the form of the building of a string of 74 Martello towers from West Folkestone to Hastings, started in 1805. They were built close to the shore, as this oil sketch of Hythe Beach demonstrates, close enough for the cannons mounted on top of each one to shoot at any targets in between. Napoleon set aside his plans to invade and moved his war machine to the east and attacked Russia. 137 years later, another invasion threatened as Hitler in 1940 drew up his plans to invade Britain. 125,000 sheep and 50,000 cattle were evacuated from the marsh. And Brian Borum wrote a pamphlet titled Martello Towers, in which he states in 1940 they were used as range finders and on top of which light guns were mounted. Above the marsh and over southern England, the main battle took place. The Luftwaffe and the RAF fought the Battle of Britain. RAF airfields were bombed and strafed. Hurricanes and Spitfires engaged Dornier and Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt 109 and 110 fighters. The Luftwaffe failed to destroy the RAF planes and airfields, and Hitler too abandoned his plans to invade and moved his war machine east and attacked Russia. Then late in the war, Hitler launched wave upon wave of V-1 unmanned flying bombs targeting London. 2,500 guns were deployed along the coast, along with 1,600 barrage balloons, whilst fighters attacked and shot the V-1s down in large numbers. There was no defence against the V-2 rockets until the launching pads were captured by Allied forces. But the war was nearly at an end, and on the 8th of May 1945, peace was declared in Europe. After the war, the Martello Towers were turned into Coast Guard observation posts. Others were sold for conversion into homes. Some became cafes, others museums. Some have been demolished, others remain, which Richard Ingram's likened to upturned flower pots. The hinterland of Romney Marsh, apart from caravan sites hidden by tall hedges, must look much as it did in centuries past. The working oxen have long since gone, and few labourers work the fields. Tractors have seen to that. Dirt roads have been tarred over, but remain narrow and follow old boundaries and dikes. So driving on the marsh can only be done with care. Telephone poles often lean and lurch, and metal pylons take electricity from the atomic power stations inland. But these apart, there is a sense of remoteness and timelessness, the feeling of isolation, and with it feelings of eeriness Richard Ingram spoke of. The ancient stone churches, several isolated in fields, are far removed from the noise and claustrophobia of modern town or city complexes. And the great number of sheep William Cobbett observed in his rural rides in 1828, when he traversed Romney Marsh on his way to Dover, these are as abundant as ever. That overall whiteness that Cobbett remarked on are now mixed with the black faces of other breeds, and these faces are in sharp contrast to their white fleeces. And we should never forget that it was Romney Marsh sheep which were exported live to Australia and New Zealand, and their excellent qualities have long been recognised and admired. If the hinterland of Romney Marsh is characterised by continuity and a timeless quality, along the coastal road there is a ribbon development of nondescript bungalows, houses and holiday camps. The largest marsh town is New Romney, dominated by its church with its fine Romanesque tower. The older buildings near the church, in particular the Georgian houses, have character, and New Romney has an attractive high street. It was once a Cinque Port, but now, like a stranded whale, New Romney is a mile inland. For this section of coast is, like Dungeness, expanding with shingle laid down by tides. The only other sizable marsh conurbation is Lydd, a sizable village but scarcely a town. It boasts the largest church on the marsh, sometimes referred to as the Cathedral on the Marsh, and it has a fine perpendicular tower built at the behest of Cardinal Wolsey. The tower, during the war, was used as a military observation post, and a German bomb caused much damage to the east end of the church. The restoration has been carried out sensitively. John Piper referred to fragments of pre-conquest building in Lydd Church. This is interesting because it clearly shows there was a church on this site prior to 1066. And also, if we relate that to the Saxon Chronicles that stated that early in the 700 AD there was a gift of land near Brooklands, 5 miles distant from Lydd, and combine these two so that this area of the marsh, other than freak storms, was not covered by sea from 700 AD to the present day, and certainly not as an everyday event. Lydd was once much nearer the sea, but Dengie Marsh has pushed back the sea due to tidal deposits of shingle. Indeed, the marsh has grown by 2 metres a year, or 200 metres in 100 years, for several centuries. These shingle deposits are or have been commercially mined in several places along the road from Lydd to Dungeness. I painted this small oil of a disused excavation with my wife sitting some way off to the right hand side of the painting. One late winter's afternoon, in a field adjacent to one of these water-filled excavations, I saw a large number of white swans foraging in a field of winter greens. Their bodies are brilliant white in the slanting sun rays, and their shadows were an intense blue, and their beaks a vibrant orange. Also on this road from Lydd to Dungeness there is a bird reserve. Dungeness is the end terminal of the smallest 15-inch gauge steam passenger service in the world, although I believe in recent years they've introduced diesel engines. Founded by Captain Harvey in 1925, the rail track runs from Hythe to Dungeness. Among its 250,000 passengers a year are overseas tourists, including those who come as far away as from Japan. Some English school children use the railway to go to school as an alternative to using school buses. At Dungeness, two worlds meet, the natural world and the man-made technological world. The first lighthouse was erected in 1702, although it has to be said the Romans almost certainly had a pharos above Lymm 1600 years ago. The most recent lighthouse stands close to the seashore, but is now fully automated. But the brave new world is epitomised by the atomic power stations, which silently and with few visible emissions produce electricity for the national grid. The atom tamed. And then one thinks of the near meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power station in America and the disaster of Chernobyl. John Constable delighted in clouds and painted numerous oil sketches of them. In a modern city we are normally only have glimpses of the sky in little snatches, and unless we are up a high building, seldom have a panoramic view of uninterrupted sky. The low-lying shingle beach at Dungeness, dotted with small fishing huts and fishing boats drawn up on metal hawsers, standing proud on the crown of shingle, affords views of unrestricted cloudscapes. And on the day I painted this in double watercolour, which can be read as a single sweep of beach, the sky was full of dark rain clouds, and above them the sun shone brilliantly. Out to sea, one cloud disgorged a diagonal sheet of rain. whilst the sun played on the water underneath this dark mass of cloud. The clouds, cool blue-grey in colour, contrasted with the ochres and oranges of the pebbled beach and green clusters of sea kale. Seagulls squawked and wheeled overhead, and far to the east, the chalk cliffs between Folkestone and Dover were etched white by the sun. To my right, just visible, monolithic, the atomic power stations. William Lombard in 1570 wrote in his Perambulation of Kent, Romney Marsh is famous throughout the realm as well as the ancient and wholesome ordinances for the preservation and maintenance of the banks and walls against the rage of the sea. Some 16 years later, William Camden writes of Romney Marsh, none but those who have seen it can believe how rich the soil is and what great herds of cattle it feeds, which are driven here to fatten from the furthest part of England, or with what art is embarked against the sea. The rich soils of Romney Marsh gave rise to a major centre for wool production in the Middle Ages, and this in turn brought about a measure of real prosperity, and that in turn to the number and scale of the Marsh churches. In 1337, a parliament held at Rochester passed an act to encourage Flemish weavers to settle in England, and Edward III afforded them royal protection. The Parliament further enacted Englishmen wear only English cloth. Just as man-made laws give new direction to the way societies function, so landscapes are altered by man for his use, sometimes marginally, sometimes dramatically. Certainly Romney, Walland and Guildford marshes have been wrested from the sea by man, whilst Dengie Marsh is the product of nature. Earlier we looked at the map of these marshes dated 1737. Here we look at Lewin's reconstructed map of these marshes before the 14th century. Once again we see the original Romney Marsh, identical in shape and size as today. Dengie Marsh is recognisable, but Walland and Guildford marshes at high tides were largely under the sea to a depth of 13 feet. But if we look closely at the Ree Wall, along its west side, much land has been inned from the sea in adjoining sections. Walls were built backing onto the Ree Wall in rectangles, and once completed, what had been mudflats were drained and became productive land. St Thomas's innings took 12 years to complete, began in 1162 AD and finished in 1174 AD. Baldwin's innings, next to it, took 10 years to complete and was finished in 1194 AD. And the Boniface innings took 30 years to complete. It was started in 1240 AD and completed in 1270 AD. This is to name three. This map also indicates here a much earlier innings which had taken place on Dengie Marsh dated 774 AD, were requiring a single wall to exclude the sea, but required much infilling. In 1952, a carbon-14 test of an infilling with seashells on Dengie Marsh gave a date of 400 AD. This test has a margin of error of plus or minus 120 years, so this infilling could have been as early as 280 AD. The map also shows Dengie Marsh largely the product of nature, shaped a little bit here by man. Lewin, on this map, makes 2 points about the origins of the original Romney Marsh. It was reclaimed, and I quote, "at once by the erection of the re-wall, by whom is uncertain. 2, and again I quote, some refer to the Belgae of ancient Britain who brought the art of walling from the Netherlands. Others give the credit to the Romans." Lewin goes on to say, Romney Marsh was certainly under cultivation in the time of the Romans, as Roman remains are found existing over the whole marsh. Roman coins and pottery were found at Dymchurch, at Eastgate, at Newchurch, at St Mary in the Marsh, and here at Ivychurch. And Portus Romanus was one of the 4 large Roman forts built along the Kent coast, each with a port, providing a safe haven, here it's called the Hythe Haven, for their naval ships. A 19th century excavation, limited in scope, revealed, as this black and white drawing shows, the steps to the main entrance of this huge fort, with massive columns on either side. 304 Roman coins were found. Of those decipherable, the earliest is dated AD 138 and the latest AD 383. A full list of these coins indicates a continuous occupation from AD 138 to AD 383. So if the Belgae built the re-wall prior to the Roman invasion of 43 AD, then the Romans would have made full use of it to raise livestock and grow crops. If the Romans built it, they had much experience of land reclamation and walling. They had dug the Carr Dyke, a drainage ditch from Lincoln to Cambridge, some 90 miles in length. And the re-wall, some 20 foot high, 8 miles in length, from Appledore to Romney, was well within their capability. And we only have to remind ourselves that the Royal Military Canal is 40 miles long and was dug by hand in 2 years. The prize of the re-wall was to gain 20,000 acres of the most fertile soils in Britain. Whenever it was built, it was a prize which was retained by the heroic efforts of countless individuals over 2 millennia. During the Middle Ages, there was an uneasy accommodation and a degree of independence between church and state. There was church law and there was state law. And of course there was the conflict between Henry II and Sir Thomas à Becket. But the post-invasion period after 1066 was characterised by enormous energy expressed in the building of keeps, castles and royal palaces on the one hand, and monastic buildings and parish churches on the other. The kings and their barons owed much land, but the church too had vast areas under its jurisdiction. Much of the land of Romney Marsh was church land, and even in 1737, 2 centuries after the dissolution of the monasteries, parts of Romney Marsh have kept their ecclesiastical names. As we see from the map of 1737, one district is called Thomas à Becket watering and the other Paternoster watering. And the Archbishop of Canterbury had extensive property at Aldington. As mentioned, the Archdeacon of Canterbury had a manor house at Lymm. Church lands were centrally administered at Canterbury, and to give concrete expression to this connection between Romney Marsh and Canterbury, I did a number of watercolours of Canterbury Cathedral near to and from the River Stour, including one within the cathedral precincts. This watercolour was in fact painted in the Garden of Remembrance, which includes a stone cross. In its tone, it is lighter than the dark mass of copper beech foliage behind it. Another watercolour features the cathedral, seen from the west bank of the River Stour, and to the right is a rare former domestic monastic building which escaped Henry VIII's demolition squads. It is now used by King's School as an art studio, and during the Canterbury Annual Arts Festival it has also been used as an exhibition space. This watercolour includes the same monastic building as in the previous watercolour, but also another on the right bank, and adjacent to it is the Marlow Theatre, a former cinema. I've always been fascinated by water reflections when reality is inverted, and this expanse of the river is no exception. The last watercolour is also the Stour, but I've included the sluice, which draws water off from what formerly was a mill race. And above the sluice and between trunks and branches there was a watery winter sun, its light reflected in the turbulence of water below. Some former monastic buildings can be seen at a distance, but in silhouette. We do not have to be a Christian or believe in God to enjoy and delight in the remnants of the rich medieval legacy of monastic buildings, including the cathedrals and parish churches which escaped the destruction wrought by Henry VIII. Not least the Romney Marsh churches which John Piper so admired, and as he wrote, owed much of their beauty to centuries of weathering. We can enjoy these churches as an integral part of our history as an island race, admire the creativity and ingenuity and craftsmanship of our distant ancestors on Romney Marsh. We may enjoy them as we do sculpture, admiring their shapes, forms, the juxtaposition of materials, including their colours and textures, and delight in their settings as part of the Romney Marsh landscape. We can attend religious services in these churches or visit them on our own and enjoy the silence of their interiors. If we believe in God, we see them too as an expression of buildings created to worship and glorify Him. We can discover these churches by accident or by design, seeking them out with the assistance of a map. We may visit them on foot, on cycles, by car, or even, as William Cobbett did, on a horse. I read recently Ellsworth Ketley, the American abstract artist who is presently exhibiting in the Tate Gallery, was a soldier in France at the latter end of the war, where he had opportunity to indulge his passion for Romanesque architecture. And he's reported in the Observer of June the 1st, 1997, of saying the effect of the Romanesque architecture on him, the effect of the big stone buildings and the extraordinary spaces and the anonymity of it all. So I conclude with the remainder of the medieval buildings which grace these fertile levels in rich and various forms. The church, Bilsington, St Peter and St Paul. The church is some distance from the narrow road which drops down from Bilsington over the Royal Military Canal and onto the marsh. I painted it from an adjacent farmyard looking across an L-shaped stretch of reed-filled water, and from this viewpoint its squat tower is scarcely higher than the pink tiled roof, and the roof is deep, and the whole has an intimate, almost barn-like appearance, with a screen of trees behind it. The watercolour is divided into two, and the bottom half is an extension of the upper section. It includes a bank behind which, but partially obscured, is the orange tile roof of the farmhouse, with its darker red tiled walls throwing up the white window frames into sharp relief. Cool grey flat broken clouds in horizontal layered bands overlay banks of white clouds. Rockinge, St Mary Magdalene. The churchyard runs parallel to Aldington-Tenterton Road. The Norman stone tower is broad and squat and is delightfully textured and subtly coloured by centuries of weathering. It is topped with a ballet-skirted roof crowned with a lead pinnacle and a weather vane. At its base is a typical Norman arched doorway, with another small Norman doorway on the south facade. A wide, deep roof covers nave and aisles, and separately the chancel. The red tiles are discoloured by lichen growths in places, yellow and orange, but there is a unity to the whole. And I painted Rockinge Church on several occasions in bright sunshine, and also when the sun has shone on the tower, and behind it dark storm clouds have filled the eastern sky, throwing up the Norman tower into stark relief. Early spring, Bonington, St Romuald. John Piper in 1947 wrote, "The planting of the churchyard is not suitable for the surroundings." 50 years on, the marvellous beech trees partly obscure this small, intimate church even in winter, but I would not have it otherwise. I painted these trees in close-up and here in this watercolour at a greater distance. Like St Thomas's of Becket, Fairfield, St Romuald is isolated, and the nearest village, Bonington, is over a mile away. The church is built on elevated ground just north of the Royal Military Canal, and it commands a good vantage point to overlook it. In the foreground is a wooden gate, its bare wood tinged yellow, and beside it a blackberry bush and a cement and metal fence. The road takes the eye back to the beech trees, their leaf buds swollen, their trunks pale against the dark green evergreen yew trees. And the sky was near cloudless, and the church trees and fields were bathed in a soft early spring light. The church nudges back from the trees, crowned with a squat 17th century bell-cot tower. And the church is interestingly dedicated to what might be described as an eccentric saint, St Romuald, said to have been the son of the Northumbrian king, St Alchfrid. He said that he could speak at birth about learned and weighty matters, and on the third day preached eloquently to his parents, and then unfortunately died. A story which implies precocity is more important than longevity. Lord Vesey, the economist, is buried in the churchyard, and at Bonington, a mile away, there is an ancient oak tree under which the elite court sat to judge matters of local importance. Early spring, Snave, St Augustine. Snave is a stone church of some size with a tower, nave and somewhat smaller chancel. The new Ashford Brooklands Road passes it to the west, but at some distance. The old road is now a loop of the new one, but little used by traffic. Just off this old road is a house and a couple of bungalows. The church can be approached through a wooden gate, and up a narrow but longer field, and the day I painted Snave, the field was, as was the churchyard, awash with daffodils, trumpeting their brief glory. If the church is not wholly distinguished, it is delightfully sited with fields on all sides. I painted Snave from the north To my right was a dyke and some fine mature beech trees. To my left a field of winter sown wheat. A pathway led to St Augustine's Snave. Early spring, a small oil painting. The reflection of the sun lies deep in the clear water-filled dyke, a dyke which cuts deep into the land, like countless others, draining excess water from the marsh. Short, dark-cut reeds are inverted in reflections. A tree, yet to burst its buds in spring's greening, creates a strong vertical shape in contrast to the horizontal of the horizon. Widely dispersed over Romney Marsh are a number of ruined churches, but there are also some secular ruins. This is one. It is a small farmhouse, now completely derelict. In painting it, I recall the lines of T.S. Eliot in his 4 quartets at the start of the second, titled East Cocker. In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Old stone to new buildings, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur and feces, bone of men and beast, corn stalk and leaf. Houses live and die, and there is a time for building and a time for living and generation, and a time for the wind to break the loosened pane, and to shake the wainscot where the field mouse trots, and to shake the tattered arras woven with a silent motto. The roads that crisscross the marsh are invariably narrow. Coming down onto the marsh from the Weald of Kent, the sky was overcast, but horse chestnut trees set back from the road were ablaze with white candles set against the dark green foliage. Low hawthorn bushes were covered in the whitest of white blossom. Spring had come to the marsh, and beside the road was a long pile of straw impregnated with cattle dung, shaped like a miniature mountain range, and behind the horse chestnut trees the gaunt, twisted trunks of pine trees. Out on the fields, thousands of unshorn ewes had given birth to their young. Lambs chased one another in a long line along a hillock. One lamb stood on the back of its recumbent mother, whilst another jumped into the air, and at the zenith of its jump, its body twisted in muscular ecstasy. William Blake included in his Songs of Innocence a poem to the lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and all the mead, gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing woolly bright, gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee, little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild, and he became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb, we are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee, little lamb, God bless thee. A walled garden in May, a brick-walled, tree-filled garden in May. At the base of a cascade of willow leaves, there was this flower-filled bed, seemingly running riot, with pale yellow sea poppies, low beds of forget-me-nots, white-petalled and yellow-scented oxide daisies. A small oil painting of a typical narrow marsh road. The road, purplish grey in colour, and below it a grass verge dropping into a dike with bluish green coloured water, and on the nearest bank dried ochre grass. These bands of colour combine to create a painting, and across a field in front of a screen of trees there was a white house, and the sky a sultry haze. Summer, St Mary's in the Marsh. Across the reed-filled dike, its water coloured by algae a bright chrome yellow, and over a field of ripened corn, in the middle distance flanked by trees, is the stone church with its tower and steeple, St Mary on the Marsh. Here Roman pottery was found in the last century, and in its churchyard E. Nesbitt, author of The Railway Children, is buried. Noel Card early in his career rented a cottage nearby and then moved to Aldington overlooking the marsh in the pre-1939 years. In this watercolour, dark clouds hung heavily over the marsh levels, harbingers of autumn and harvest. New Church, St Peter and St Paul. New Church is set in a small village and is built entirely of stone, not unlike Ivy Church but somewhat smaller. The south-eastern part of the north boundary of the church is flanked by tall, mature trees. The elm trees Piper mentions in 1947 have, along with all the other marsh elms which grew on the marsh, even going back to Roman times, have gone, victims of Dutch elm disease. But horse chestnuts, sycamores and beech trees obscure the church as it is approached from most directions, but when seen close to the church and its outward-leaning tower have a singular monumental quality. Piper observed in 1947 the unsympathetic repointing between the stones, and this repointing is raised above the level of the stones, which gives the surface a somewhat sterile appearance. There are porches north and south of size and substance. Brooklands, St Augustine. A new road bypasses Brooklands, so the former through traffic is now diverted to the new road. So Brooklands is no longer a village divided by a constant stream of traffic. The bell tower stands beside the body of the church on the north side, rather like an Italian campanile. Its porch has a double door, top and bottom, reminiscent of a horse stable door. Internally, the church has a central nave and no chancel. It has north and south aisles either side, with pillars and arches which lean noticeably outwards. Wooden box pews and old tile floors give the church its warmth and contribute considerably to its atmosphere. There's a splendid 13th century lead font, which I've not included in the painting, but which features the signs of the zodiac. On the southeast corner of the church, there's a fragment of a wall painting which has been uncovered featuring the slaying of St Thomas of Becket in 1170. I also painted the exterior of Brooklands from the south, looking north from the churchyard. From the outside, it's a simple structure, perhaps lacking the interest of other marsh churches, but a building which contributes to the identity of the marsh east of the Ree Wall. As far as its interior is concerned, with all its simplicity, I find it extremely beautiful. Autumn, Warehorn, St Matthew's. The original stone tower was struck by lightning in 1777, and it was uniquely for marsh churches rebuilt in a pinkish red brick. The warm colours of the brick tower are sharply contrasted with the cool colours of the stone of the original building. I painted this watercolour from an adjoining field, and the fence between it and the churchyard had collapsed, and sheep were eating the luxuriant grass in the churchyard. I saw a solitary woman mushrooming over a period of hours. It was the colours of the brick and stonework and the tree shadows falling on them, and a build-up of the dark cloud behind the tower which brought about an interplay of tones and colours which engaged my attention. I divided the watercolour into two, but on this occasion I made no attempt to link the top and the bottom halves in terms of composition, but both, of course, relate to the marsh. Snargate St Dunstan's. When I left Warehorn, it was already dusk, and I took the road, which was extremely narrow, over the canal, and I came across, by accident, Snargate Church. By the church gate were 5 dwellings, no more than when William Cobbett came here on his rural rides in 1828, and the churchyard is surrounded by huge trees. The fading light, the large stone tower loomed above my head, joined to the exterior of the north aisle. There was nothing to link me to the 20th century, and for a short time I felt a strong sense of disassociation with time present. Fading light became night, and the lines of T.S. Eliot came to me, and the moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. I returned some days later, early in the morning, selecting a place to paint the church with care. I chose to paint the tower close up, with this acute perspective. Weathering and lichen discoloured the silvery stonework, and around the church the foliage was already autumnal, and the mass of the church was monumental and overpowering. Autumn, a small oil. A modest Georgian house on the outskirts of Beaumarsh overlooks a sheep-filled field. To the right, a deep dike, and just discernible in it, the water reflects the evening sky, coloured pink. The sun, low in the sky, towards sunset, is coloured lemon yellow, surrounded by a dull orange cloud bank. Autumn, Ivy Church, St George. Ivy Church is one of the largest Romney Marsh churches. The main body of the church is a long central nave running directly into the chancel, flanked by 2 wide aisles. All seats have been removed, which increases the sense of spaciousness. And unlike most Marsh churches, which are now kept locked, Ivy Church remains open at all times. Piper refers to the pitting and scouring of the stonework, which reflects the changing weather, and to use his words, dark on a grey day and pale and silvery on a clear one. The church was built in 1370, and the tower, which is castellated and buttressed, was added shortly after. Another external feature is the large stone castellated porch on the south side, and the flowing tracery of the windows. So the monumental overall quality of the building is contrasted with window tracery inset into these centuries-old stone walls. The day I painted Ivy Church, it was a hazy autumn day. I've used transparent washes with colour shifts to realise this splendid church. And as with most Marsh churches, there are stories how empty tombs were used to hide contraband in the days when anarchy, enterprise, business and tax evasion were part and parcel of everyday Marsh life. And to that list I could include a reluctance to enter matrimony. And it's worth reminding ourselves too that malaria was endemic on the marsh up until the 20th century. Late autumn, Appledore, St Peter and Paul. Appledore is built on rising ground. It was from Appledore that the re-wall was built running to New Romney. And this painting includes a stretch of the Royal Military Canal. A watery late autumn afternoon sun was in part veiled by thin grey clouds. The land, bushes and trees were drained of colour, their shapes united by grey-blue tones of varying density. And to the extreme right, on the brow of the hill, the church of St Peter and St Paul could just be discerned, surrounded by leafless trees. It was the view recommended by John Piper 50 years ago, and it was his recommendation that brought me here. Winter, New Romney, St Nicholas. Romanesque architecture is invariably squat and thick-set. New Romney's church tower is no exception. It dominates the skyline when seen far off and the town when seen close to. The base of the tower is a rounded Norman doorway, accessed several feet below the road. Once the Cinque Ports church and town were on the shore, now both are a mile inland. The remaining parts of the church dedicated to St Nicholas are Norman and transitional. I drew the east facade in charcoal, and on another occasion painted the church from the north side, looking back the length of the north church wall and back towards the church tower. Winter, Dymchurch, St Peter and St Paul. Its Norman origins are not discernible from outside. A Norman arched doorway is obscured by a recent porch. Inside there is a spacious Norman arch leading to the chancel. And the north side of the church has been extended outwards, which gives an asymmetric interior, which includes a modernised gallery, which John Piper refers to, with its fine royal arms hung upon its front. The church's exterior includes a small tower, again a recent addition. The top section is made of red tiles, as is the roof of the chancel, whilst the remaining roof is grey slate. And these colour shifts, along with the pale grey stones of the exterior and the pale brown stones of the porch, create a subtle interplay of colour. To extend that, a foreground maple tree trunk, pale grey in colour, has yellow patches on it. And these continue, these subtle interchanges of colour shifts, along with the blue snatches of sky. Winter Burmarsh, All Saints. The church is an integral part of a small village. It includes Norman features with 15th century additions, much restored in Victorian times, and of its interior John Piper described it as commonplace, and he regretted the removal of the box pews which still exist at Brooklands and in Old Romney Church. I painted the pale stone exterior set off by the pale pink tiles of the chalk porch and the dense green beech trees. These were observed from the road with a water-filled ditch above which rose a bank covered in vegetation. Sea mist drifted across the land, softening the hard edges of buildings and trees, sometimes obscuring them entirely. Brenzett, St Eansworth and Old Vicarage. William Cobbett in his rural rides writes amusingly and informatively of his journey across Romney Marsh. When leaving Appledore, he writes first about Snargate, a village he wrote of 5 houses and a church capable of containing 2,000 people. Then a mile further on he attempts to get bacon and an egg at Brenzett, and in that endeavour fails to get an egg. He writes, the few houses that there are miserable in the extreme, and the church here nearly as large as Snargate. He then goes on to speculate on the sparse population of Romney Marsh and whether it was always so. Cobbett, with reference to the churches of Appledore, Snargate and now Bresnet, asked the question, if these churches were erected without there being any more people than there are now, but who built them? I painted both church and the old vicarage separately in winter. One massive beech tree in the field adjoining the vicarage garden must have been old when Cobbett was here. It had a massive bough which was growing along the ground before it rears up like the neck of a dinosaur. In painting the vicarage, it was the tree trunks which challenged me. Leafless, the branches create an interplay of forms like a frozen dance. The sky was streaked with pale grey clouds, and the vicarage, with its orange tile roof and darker red wall tiles, threw up the white painted window frames in a strong tonal relief, and I was reminded of the farmhouse at Bilsington. The church stood in front of leafless trees. The sun shone on it. There were small pieces of brick used to infill the wall. The irregular shaped roof with its tiles in part discoloured with lichen, and the squat tower create an irregular symmetry which is so characteristic of medieval architecture, which can follow its own rules. Carnarvonton St Mary. This church is not easy to find without careful reference to a map, and it stands some distance from a narrow lane accessed between the drives of 2 remote houses. It stands on a rise overlooking the marsh, said to be the site of a Danish camp, and the Danes were dislodged by King Alfred's troops. Once a large church, it was destroyed by lightning and an ensuing fire, and what remains is the tower and the south aisle, and these are not internally connected. From the churchyard one can, looking east, just see the brick tower of Warehorn on the brow of the hill. I painted Carnarvonton on a winter's day, and as the sun sank in the east it cast long shadows of the tall trees behind me growing in a neighbouring large garden, and these shadows fell across the grass of the churchyard and onto the walls of the church, creating an optical interplay of warm and cool colours. A woman walking her dog stopped and said out loud, "But no one comes here into our churchyard." I wished her a good afternoon, and she and her dogs disappeared through a garden gate. Winter Fairfield, St Thomas of Canterbury. This isolated church was, in the first decade of the 20th century, a ruin. W.D. Currow rebuilt it in 1913 using much of the original material as possible. The interior includes white box pews and pulpit picked out in black. The church is the smallest of all the Marsh churches, not larger than a modest-sized house. The warm brick of the walls and the near Naples chrome-coloured tiles of the nave and chancel and the tiny western tower contrast with the flat green fields intersected with dykes, in which the blue sky is reflected, and the church stands in complete isolation. Sheep wander freely, nibbling the grass up to the walls of this church. I quote some lines from a meditation on the marsh, a poem by Rex Muffet. Hear church bells wavering soft from Burmarsh, Brookland, Mary in the Marsh. In spring you'll hear the harebells too, if your ear is enough fine-tuned for them. Hear bells from Bresenet, Snargate and Snave. Step along the causeway among the sheep at Beckett's Fairfield. She sits marooned in quietness on this green sea. Why build for Thomas here? I cannot tell you. Maybe for the kneeling sheep. See Brooklands with its magic tent for bells. It might have sailed from Bethlehem for sheep to shelter in, perhaps a couple and their child too. Midleigh. The ruin of Midleigh, north of Lydd, is but a fragment of the original building. It stands on a slightly elevated area of ground in green fields with not a building in sight. We are reminded of William Cobbett's questioning the sparse population of Romney Marsh in 1828 and asking who built these churches. The map of 1737 shows Midleigh, and on the map, there are a handful of houses close to it, but only a handful. Was it always so? Now Midleigh is a complete ruin. John Piper drew Midleigh close too. I chose to paint it in the far distance, set in a wide expanse of level fields. The only feature in the foreground was a dyke, which scimitar-like moved in a curve from right to left to the middle distance. It was filled with dried reeds and tall grasses. To the left, winter wheat, its emerald shoots piercing the earth. A winter sun, a pale yellow, moved towards the horizon in a cloud-filled sky. In painting this watercolour, I saw no one. Here I was isolated, as is common when travelling in northwest Scotland. But here the earth is level, sculpted by tides moving in and out every 12 hours over countless centuries. I was alone and completely content in my isolation. Old Romney, St Clement. I painted the exterior and interior of Old Romney in winter. The church is set well back from the coastal road, and it stands in green fields, but to the northeast is offset by a cluster of mature trees and a handful of houses, which are, however, scarcely visible. The church tower is placed at the southeast corner of the church, and access is by way of the porch on the opposite side. John Piper wrote of its interior, "It is," he wrote, "one of the best and least spoiled Georgian interiors in the country," giving an excellent idea of what a village church was like 150 years ago. Well, it was 50 years since John Piper made that evaluation, so we must add on those 50 years to make sense of his observation. The church has been sensitively restored under the guidance of Anthony Swain, an architect now retired, with a deep love of medieval architecture, who it was my good fortune to meet and talk to in the 1970s. John Piper referred to the grey box pews, but these are now painted a pale pink, edge black. But the whitewashed walls and the oak beams of the roof and the arches dividing the small south aisle to the nave, which in turn leads to the chancel, over which hangs the royal arms, have not altered since Piper painted this interior. Perhaps I could conclude with the last lines of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, who evokes as part of his rich imagery the feelings engendered on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel. We die with the dying sea they return and bring us with them. And the moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments. So while the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now in England. And with the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time, through the unknown remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, and the voice of the hidden waterfall, and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick now, here now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crown knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one.